You stood in the tool aisle last Tuesday night holding a saw you already owned two of. You knew you owned two. You bought it anyway. You did not need it for anything. There is no project on your bench right now. There is no blueprint taped to the wall. There is just the saw, the weight of it in your hand, and something in your chest that loosened the second your fingers closed around the handle. You have done this before, more than once. The drill in your garage still has the manufacturer sticker on the side. You bought it 11 months ago. You own 3 sets of clamps. You have used one set twice. You told your wife last spring that you did not need any more tools. You said it while standing in a store holding a tool. Half the pegboard in your garage is hardware you have touched exactly once, the day you hung it up. There's a torque wrench in your toolbox still in its case. You bought it for a job you never got around to starting. You have watched a video on how to use a tool you own before you have ever actually used it. You know exactly how much it cost. You do not know what it is for. You do not call it a problem. You call it being prepared. You call it having options. You have never once called it what your wife privately calls it, which is a museum. You are not lying when you say that. You genuinely believe the options matter more than the outcome. And here's the part that will surprise you. You are right, just not in the way you think. There is a man in Tulsa named Gerald. He is 64. He spent 32 years as a machinist before the plant closed and folded his job into early retirement. His garage has a rolling chest with 6 drawers, a wall of clamps organized by size, and a router table he assembled from a kit and has used exactly once. His wife, Diane, calls it his other job. She says it gently, the way you talk about something you have made peace with, instead of something you understand. The first 2 years of retirement, Gerald built things, a workbench for his grandson, a set of shelves for the garage itself, which even he laughed about once he noticed the irony. Then, the projects thinned out. The neighbors stopped needing help. His hands, which had run a lathe to 1,000th of an inch for 3 decades, went quiet. He started driving to the hardware store on Saturday mornings. No list, just the aisles. He would come home with a set of dial calipers he already owned a version of, or a marking gauge he had seen a woodworker use online. Diane noticed the charges on the card and asked him once what he was building. Gerald said he was staying ready. He could not explain it any better than that, and not being able to explain it bothered him more than the money did. Diane found him one evening standing at the workbench with a new caliper still in its box, turning it over in his hands without opening it. She stood in the doorway. She did not say anything. After a while, Gerald said, "I just like knowing it's here." Diane nodded and went back inside. She never brought up the receipt again that month. Something in the way he said it landed somewhere she recognized, even without the words for it. Here is what people get wrong about this. They see a man buying tools he never uses, and they assume it is carelessness with money, or restlessness, or some quiet crisis he will not name out loud. What they miss is that the tool was never the point. The tool was always a stand-in for something else, and the something else is not a small thing. Psychologists who study buying behavior have a name for this pattern: tool acquisition disorder, and the woodworking world uses the term half-joking. The joke lets everyone laugh it off at the dinner table without ever having to look at what is underneath it. But underneath the joke is a real mechanism, and it runs deeper than the wallet. Every tool you buy without a project attached is a piece of compressed potential. Not what you are doing, what you could do. The reward does not come from owning it. It comes from the moment you are still holding the possibility in your hand before it becomes anything. Researchers have mapped this. The brain's reward circuit fires hardest at the edge of anticipation, not at the finish line. There's a second layer running underneath that one. A researcher named Kelly Lambert studies what she calls the effort-driven reward circuit, the direct line between your hands doing physical work and your brain producing the chemistry that makes you feel steady. That circuit does not fully know the difference between using a tool and holding one. The weight of it, the resistance in the grip. Your nervous system responds to the tool in your hand almost the same way it would respond to the tool in use. Then there is the third thing, and this is the one that explains the pegboard better than any of the others. Psychologists call it self-efficacy, the felt sense that your actions actually produce something real. Most of your week does not give you that. You sit in meetings, you answer messages, you finish tasks that leave nothing behind you can point to and say, I made that. The tool on the wall is the opposite of that feeling. Even unused, it says you could. It is proof of agency, sitting quietly on a hook. And there is one more thing happening that you have never had a name for. Psychologists call it the Zeigarnik effect, the mind's habit of holding on to anything unfinished far more tightly than anything completed. Every tool you bought and never used is an open loop. It does not disappear from your attention just because it sits still. It hums in the background. It ties you to a version of yourself that is still building, still planning, still reaching towards something. Your garage is not a graveyard of wasted money. It is a shelf of unfinished business. And unfinished business is exactly what keeps a man tethered to the future instead of just enduring the present. This did not start with you. Men who came home from building things with their hands raised sons who watched them do it. And those sons grew up wiring houses and pouring foundations of their own. Now their sons sit at a desk for 9 hours and produce a report no one will remember by Friday. The hardware store is one of the last places where effort still equals something you can hold. The garage itself is part of this. It is the one room in the house that never got negotiated. The living room belongs to everyone. The kitchen belongs to everyone. The garage belongs to you. Nobody signed anything. Nobody had to. Every tool on that wall is a small territorial marker that says, this space is still active, still yours, still not finished. A man who stops adding to that wall has a garage that has gone quiet, and a quiet garage is a warning sign nobody in the house has the language to read. It looks like nothing changed. What actually happened is that a man stopped reaching towards something, and the wall is the only place that kept score. You are not a man who wastes money on tools you do not need. You are a man whose hands are still asking for something the rest of your week refuses to give them. And buying the tool is the only sentence your nervous system knows how to write. The wall is not evidence that you failed to follow through. It is evidence that some part of you refused to stop reaching forward. Diane never got a real answer out of Gerald, and eventually she stopped needing one. She started noticing instead that on the nights he came in from the garage empty-handed, having just stood there looking at the wall, he slept better. He was easier to talk to at dinner. Something had been set down that had nothing to do with a project getting finished. That is the part almost no one names correctly. The tool was never really about the tool. It was about a man proving to himself, quietly and without an audience, that the part of him built to solve problems still had somewhere to point. You will probably buy another one. You already know that. You are just not going to explain it to anyone who asks.